Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, I'm taking a closer look at the Nippon Kogaku 50mm f2 H.C lens for the Leica thread mount or M39 mount. This is a legendary lens that really helped put Nikon on the map. It was produced between 1946 and 1962 and helped establish Japan's reputation for world-class optics after World War II. And this lens in particular is known for its high center sharpness, high micro contrast, and dreamy, pleasing bokeh. But before we really dive into it and all the lens can do, we need to take a step back and look at the history first and remember the early 1950s. Back then it was quite common to use a rangefinder camera, especially for photojournalists. It was either a Leica or a Zeiss context camera. And the photojournalist David Douglas Duncan of Live magazine famously used this particular 50mm lens and an 85mm Nikkor lens on his Leica body because he considered this lens to be more contrasty and sharper and snappier, in his words, in comparison to the Leitz alternatives at the time. And this, of course, helped build Nikon's reputation at a time where the only Japanese competition to Leica and Contax cameras were the Canon rangefinders, and before the Nikon S really took off, people kind of noticed that the lenses, the Nikkor lenses, were considered quite good by the professionals. And from an optical perspective, his assessment makes complete sense, because if we take a closer look at the Leitz Summicron back then, the standard lens, so to speak, is a classic planar design or double Gauss design, versus this 50mm lens here is a sonar design in 6 elements in 3 groups. So the H in the name stands for hexa, Latin 6, and the C for coding. And the sonar design has fewer air-to-glass surfaces than the planar design, and in an era before advanced multi-coating was a thing, this of course meant less internal flare and higher micro contrast. And this is why DDD, as he was called, David Douglas Duncan, considered this particular lens snappier, and this of course holds true until today, especially if you're shooting film anyways. Then it makes a lot of sense to look at this particular lens. Another important reason is its price. The lens can typically be had for 200 to 250 euros in great condition from, I would recommend, Japanese sellers. As always, when you're hitting the vintage market, I would advise you to take a very close look at the described condition, all the fine print, and all the images that are provided. In this particular case, some lenses are prone to developing haze or fungi. But if you get one in great condition, you can, be very lucky and get one that is just beautiful in terms of its rendering, its quality, and so on. And it's common for these kinds of lenses. They can be adapted to any modern Leica M camera or any modern film camera as well. So this is pretty, like an M film camera, of course, this is pretty nice, but you can also tap into the large pool of LTM rangefinders, like the Canon rangefinders as I did here, or any Oscar Barnack Leica as well. So in my particular case, I used the lens on my Canon VT Deluxe, shooting all sorts of street shots during photo walks in Paris, Berlin, and Munich in the course of the winter. It was particularly nice using the Canon VT Deluxe for that, kind of with that Leica Vite-like rapid advanced mechanism to get to the next frame, and using gloves on that is particularly nice. And I also used the lens on my Leica M4II with an adapter, kind of a typical 50mm rangefinder combination. Very nice for this kind of setup. As always, the films were developed and scanned by my trusted on-film lab in Frankfurt, and I can't wait to share the results here with you. Let's dive in there. So what about the features and optical design? There were actually three different versions of this lens. The first one was produced between 1946 and 1949, and these were primarily collapsible lens designs, with earlier ones being produced with German shot glass and then later ones with Nikon glass. So these are very similar to a Leitz LMR from the same era that could be collapsed into the camera. Then we have the second version, which was produced between 1950 and 1960, these kind of rigid chrome version that we can see here. And there's an important difference for collectors. The earlier ones produced until 1953 say Tokyo on the ring around the lens next to the Nippon Kogaku, and the later ones, like mine here, say Japan on it. And the later ones apparently had a better coating as well, which is particularly interesting for those that want a well-corrected lens. But I was also explained that these are over-corrected in comparison to the collapsible ones, the earlier ones. And then there was a last version of the lens produced from 1960 to 62 that comes with a black focus ring or even all black barrel. And these are often lighter because they began using more aluminum instead of brass in the construction. So if that is important to you, you might want to hunt for one of those. But this version, unfortunately, is particularly rare as LTM, so they tend to be collector pieces. As mentioned and indicated by the name of the lens, this is a 6 elements and 3 groups sonar design, and in contrast to the Leitz glass at the time, it close focuses up to 1.5 or 2 feet, which is amazing, of course, and it even has a soft spot here, like a stop here in between, like a point of resistance that you need to overcome that is around 1 meter. That kind of indicates you when using a Canon rangefinder, this is as far as you can close focus with that camera, or also the Oscar Barnett cameras from the time. But then you could go further, and by then in practice you would have to either guess the distance to your subject or measure it carefully, which probably makes more sense at close distances. Or for a digital camera today, you could just transition to a live view mode and look through that, and then even close focus with that lens down to 1.5 feet, which of course is quite amazing given the age of that particular lens. This Nikkor typically comes with 10 aperture blades, which help create that particularly pleasing bokeh across all apertures. So even the stops in between helps these 10 aperture blades help retain creating really nice bokeh balls without a lot of onion rings, but we will get to that in a minute. The lens feels quite hefty and is often described as jewelry-like in the reviews that I've seen. For my taste, it has just exactly the right weight with the 250 grams. It doesn't feel too heavy, but it really feels solid and like a high-quality piece of glass and chrome and brass. So a really, really nice lens, high-quality feel. And yeah, I've said that before, they just don't build them like that anymore. The filter size is 40.5 millimeters, which is quite common, as you know, and it was also one of the standards for the Nikon S rangefinders. And by the way, of course, this is a Nikon S rangefinder lens as well, primarily, that also happens to be available in LTM, which of course is more sought after. But if you are curious about the Nikon S rangefinders, we did an entire video on that, and I can point you in that direction if you're curious about those lenses and getting the whole Nikon S experience. Then please do yourself a favor and take a look at that as well. The LTM version can be adapted to any Leica M camera from 1954 all the way up until today, which of course is amazing and makes this 200 to 250 euro lens quite interesting from today's perspective. And even if you are into sonar designs and just want to establish a little bit of a collection of different sonar designs, then this is something that doesn't break the bank and is still quite accessible in comparison to a card size sonar lens that you could also find today, and more expensive vintage alternatives as well. So this is a great choice in my opinion, and if you just want to shoot it, this particular late version here that I have is particularly interesting. So what about the optical performance and results? I was so surprised when seeing the first photographs taken with that particular lens. I couldn't believe that this is a 1950s lens, and to see the kind of sharpness, micro contrast, and especially the pleasing bokeh that it produced. I completely understand from today's perspective that if you compare this lens and its performance to a 1950s Leitz LMR lens, even if it's a coated one, but especially if it's an uncoated one, I understand why David Douglas Duncan was so convinced to go for this lens here instead of a Leitz lens back then. It's simply remarkable, and that holds true until today, and especially if you're shooting film anyways, black and white film, you will still be able to see the kind of quality that this lens produces. So more specifically, what do you get? Personally, I was particularly surprised by the wonderful bokeh that it creates. You have that typical sonar design that helps create the characteristic dreamy background. You have transitions from the in focus to the out of focus areas that are simply beautiful. The 10 blade aperture helps retain beautiful bokeh balls, so you don't have these less pleasing onion rings that you sometimes get, or particularly busy bokehs. But as you can see in my images from Paris, for instance, you get these really soft, glowy backgrounds that draw you into the image. Both sharpness and micro contrast are remarkably high in my opinion, even wide open at f2, especially in the center. This is common for sonars, that the corners are rather soft, but once you step down to f4 and especially to f5.6, the corners improve noticeably. And thanks to the rather advanced coating, the contrast is retained even in backlit situations, which was quite an achievement back then in the 1950s. And the lens in general handles backlight so much better than most 1950s lenses that I have tried before. I would exclude my Tokyo Kogaku Nikkor S that I have discussed here before. That is, I would say, on par with this one here. But when pointing this particular lens here directly into the sun, you can still get beautiful flares and beautiful effects, but it's not something that completely destroys your image and only creates this soft, glowy, blurry thing. Destroy is relative. Some people, of course, go for that particular effect, and I understand that. But if you want a lens that helps you control these kinds of flares, then this one here is surprisingly good at it. A common problem for these lenses is focus shift, which we have discussed extensively in my 50mm Berthollet review. So if you're curious about that, take a look at that review and also how it was resolved for that particular lens. So if that is important to you to not have focus shift, please take a look at that particular lens. Color rendering is great as well, and surprisingly so in my opinion. This lens tends to create a little bit of a warmer tone, so it's not a perfect color reproduction, but especially if you're shooting Kodak Go 200 and kind of a film stock that has a naturally warmer tone, and then you do it in warmer sunlight, you get a very nice vintage feel to the images because of the kind of color rendering that this lens here produces. Personally, I really like that, and it's a good lens to have if you're after this particular look. The lens is well suiting for shooting portraits in my opinion, due to that high center sharpness, the high contrast, and then the beautiful bokeh. And of course you don't really care about corner sharpness when shooting portraits typically. If you position your subject at the dead center of the frame, then this effect is actually nice to kind of draw people into your image, have a little bit of a softer corner, have fall off towards the corners. All these effects that are common for this lens here kind of help accentuate the effect of a good vintage portrait here. And to my eyes, this is a great portrait lens for 200 to 250 euros. If you want to shoot portraits and you don't mind the 1 meter minimum focusing distance that you typically have on a rangefinder, an LTM rangefinder, then perfect. And as mentioned before, on a digital camera, you could potentially also easily go closer and still be able to focus accurately. So a wonderful optical performance in my view, and a really remarkable lens. what about the handling and my personal impressions? I love the handling of this particular lens. The operation is so smooth and intuitive, and people who know me know that I love a focusing tab, and it's the same here. And I also don't mind the infinity lock. I think it's quite convenient and fitting to such a lens. So for me, in terms of operation, when out and about with street shots and so on, it was a very nice lens because it is just the right balance of having a short focusing throw, but enough of it to accurately focus and feel confident about your focusing. And then for those switching to live view and going even closer to your subject, then there's quite a distance to travel with the focusing throw here to really accurately focus even at closer distances. And that I found interesting. Of course, I typically used it on a Canon rangefinder, so my minimum focusing distance was 1 meter, and this is also what most people will use it for. And if that is not a limitation for you when shooting portraits with a 50mm lens, then I think it's a great portrait lens that is definitely worth taking a look at. Precisely because it creates amazing sharpness, it has that very nice color rendition, it creates nice contrasts, and it draws people in because of how it renders the image in the corners as well. I particularly like that this lens comes with that kind of silver, shiny, chrome-plated brass, and at least in my eyes, perfectly matches the Canon rangefinders, which I am, as you know, are quite fond of. Of course, the lens has the same visual appearance as other Nikon S lenses and is particularly fitting to a Nikon S body. I find both options quite interesting. If you're just starting out shooting film or you want to go into rangefinders, I think this particular lens here is an interesting option, and you end up spending around 400 euro or so when purchasing a Canon rangefinder and this lens here, or when going for the Nikon S2, for instance, with a fitting 50mm f2 Nikkor lens here. These are great options to get you started, and it can also be your only lens for that particular system and you will still have a lot of fun, or you just throw in a 35mm at one point. For me, this is a very solid and perfect lens that is so much more affordable than any Leica Summicron or a Summarit, Leitz or Leitz Elmar and so on. Those are more in that ballpark sometimes, but this here is of course particularly inexpensive given the kind of quality that you're getting. I learned from Christopher Andreu from Scalani Optomechanics, though the people also behind the Bertele lens in part, that the sonar design that I have here is a little bit overcorrected. So those later 1950s lenses tend to be a bit overcorrected, and if you want a traditional sonar design, Christopher recommended to go to those earlier collapsible versions of the lens. It really comes down to your personal preferences, in my opinion, and I understand where he's coming from as a true expert of sonar lenses and somebody who repaired I think dozens of them. He really knows the differences and notices those. And for me, it's also an interesting lens to have in your Leica M or LTM collection. And personally, as touched on, I feel like it's a perfect portrait lens to have. And I was always curious in having a sonar lens in my lens collection. And as you know from my 50mm Bertele review, I was particularly drawn to that particular lens, but it's kind of the benchmark lens that is out there. It's quite expensive. You get a perfect lens for the money, and if you don't need that and don't necessarily want to afford it, but you just want to have some nice sonar in your lens collection, then I think this particular Nikkor is amazing. It's an amazing choice. You get a high quality 1950s craftsmanship, high value lens. Please do yourself a favor and take a very, very close look at all the offers that you're seeing. Sometimes they look as like a great bargain and a great deal at first glance, only 100 euro or 150. But then if you read closer, you see, oh, there's some haze or some small fungi in there, but yeah, you won't notice it on the image, but of course once it's in there it will develop over time. So I would recommend steering away from those if you don't know whether you can clean it or have somebody who can clean it for you, I would always recommend to go one in great condition and pay a little bit of a premium, and then just be happy using it and taking care of it, of course. So in my opinion, this is a great lens to have in your collection, or it can also be a very great first rangefinder lens that doesn't break the bank. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and my review of the 50mm Nippon Kogaku f2 Nikkor H.C lens, which is a truly remarkable lens, a great performer, and it makes perfect sense what David Douglas Duncan said back then, even until today. If you are shooting this lens on film, it just makes a lot of sense doing so as an alternative to the typical Summicron planar designs. If you want a sonar design, this is a great choice, and until today it will give you great results on film. You get a lot of sharpness, a lot of micro contrast, a beautiful bokeh, and of course there are some downsides around focus shift and corner fall off and softness and so on, and yet it's a very nice lens to have in your collection and use it either on a Leica M or any LTM camera. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.